discussion that we're having during the between new technologies sweeping our lives today. A great big technology companies have formed these ethics committees, and then, with great fanfare, herald trumpets sound when they form these committees. With the great heralding that they form these committees, you wait about a year and they're quietly disbanded. Why is that? Because they can't agree on the color of an orange. They can't agree on what they're trying to do, how they're trying to do it, on the other members of the committee, who's in, who has the wrong credentials, who once worked for this foundation or that one that doesn't suit anybody, on and on and on, who's not on it. They can't manage how to agree because they can't get there. So what they want is certainty. They want certainty. Now, you can't always have certainty in science or certainty in technologies, but you can have a range. Often the last small portion of variance will be the most expensive to root out and make perfect. But within what's possible financially, technologically, with time budget, so on, they want it certain, they want it fixed. Too often, we do that in matters of faith and theology as well. We crave certainty in our faith. We are impatient frequently with other faiths. We rely, all religions define themselves by what they are and what they believe, but the very act of defining them excludes anybody who is not within that box. And we particularly, we will condescend to live with them for the sake of a pluralistic society, but it is very characteristic of believers of any faith that they crave that certainty, they crave that definition, that very thing makes it very difficult to engage for any faith, any one faith, including ours, to engage with the really difficult questions of life. I may have told you this before, but for my money, the holiest place in Dallas County is the chapel at Children's Medical. Utterly ecumenical. Why is it that we want this certainty? Why is it that we will not reach out, that we will not expand, that we will not challenge even ourselves, and that we take undue refuge, I would argue, in the passage from John that says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one sees the Father except through me. Might he also have meant through how I allow to see the faith? Do we fully understand that passage? Or do we leap on it as a form of security, as a form of certainty, so that we don't have to ask these questions? A lot of questions that I'm talking about are now being put to us by the extraordinary velocity and power of the technological changes we are wreaking on ourselves. And it will not do any more, I suggest to close off, insist that everyone is wrong, everyone else is wrong, that we have a monopoly on all the truth, that there's nothing else to offer or add, and congratulate ourselves on our strong faith. There's much we can learn, and I will suggest to you within the short time that we have that when you start asking these questions and dive more deeply into these questions that are being put to us, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, when you start seeing that and exploring among all the great traditions of the world, starting with ours, but not only ours, when you see this coming from all over the globe, which it is, your heart will become lighter. And you will see possibilities. And you will see the Lord's work and the Lord's hand in ways to extend across areas that you had not previously imagined. And it is a perfectly glorious, glorious thing. Now, I have two overarching points for this morning. Point number one is ethical issues. Since they are not very fixed, they don't have a lot of boundaries on them. Yeah, I'm not talking about right and wrong. I'm talking about ethics, which is ethical issues. I read this somewhere. I can't remember where, but I wish I'd written it. Ethical issues are never solved. You do not solve ethical issues with emerging technology. You navigate them and you negotiate them as things change, as you learn more, and as you make your way through life and through time. Ethical issues are not solved. Wrong verb. They are navigated and negotiated. Hold that in mind. Hold that in mind. Now, briefly, let's talk a little bit about the history of some of these things, just the modern history of some of this stuff. In the 1920s, how many of you remember the eugenics, studying about the eugenics and what that was all about? We've got a few who do. Eugenics were an early effort to try to improve life. It started from good intentions. And what road is paved with good intentions? It started with good intentions of trying to improve things. Wound up the Tuskegee experiments, the forced lobotomies, the forced sterilizations. You may remember some of these. They were usually conducted on the vulnerable, the uninformed, and the non-consenting. That was held to be constitutional, particularly the forced sterilization of people in mental hospitals. But was it right? Was it ethical? And those questions were not fully resolved. The Cold War came along. Does MK Ultra, artichoke, or bluebird mean anything to you? I hope not. They were experiments conducted by the CIA and the U.S. Army in the 1950s in the context of the Cold War, shortly after Korea, when former U.S. POWs were repatriated to this country and were found to be suffering from all kinds of mental traumas. And a lot of it was thought to be, that's where the phrase brainwashing was first originated. It's thought that the North Korean and Chinese communists were brainwashing our troops in a number of ways. And we better study this and study ways to do it ourselves or to unbrainwash them. MK Ultra, artichoke, and bluebird were code names for three such very extensive experiments which were carried out in the 1950s. But move on to 1978. And in about 1978, Dolly, who remembers Dolly? Dolly, the sheep.
Oh, yeah.
The sheep. Dolly the sheep was cloned. First time in human history anybody been able to clone a living animal, and cloned a sheep. Now, I would add, there's a thriving market out there in cloning your pets. Now, when I'm told today you can clone your pet, but not quite. It doesn't really work all that well. And why is that? It's because the experiences, the histories, the relationships, and so on are not clonable. Physical structures are. What made your beloved dog may not be. Parenthetically, I would add that the renowned theologian Kinky Friedman wrote once that, you know what heaven's going to be like? You know what's going to happen when you get to heaven? You're going to walk in, and every pet you ever loved is going to come flying up to join. That was 1978 when we had Dolly. And it caused an enormous debate over whether we should be doing this. What is this? What should we be? What can we do? And should we be doing this? Well, meanwhile, that debate, of course, was never resolved. Why not? You don't solve ethical problems. You navigate them and negotiate as time goes on. And as time went on into the 80s, 90s, thousands, and now, there's been decades, generation of advances into the ability to improve, literally to heal brain structures with very low electrical pulses. I'm not enough of them. I'm in the early 1970s, when we still had the draft was over, but they still were trying to keep up with what the population looked like just in case. The Army sent out an aptitude test to every high school boy to take this aptitude test. And they were going to study it and score it, and then they'd send you a report and keep a copy of themselves of what they thought you'd be good at. And that way they'd know what their base looked like if they needed to go back to the draft. And mine came back that I could be an Army big shot or a truck driver. But under no circumstances, under no conceivable circumstances, could I be an electrician. That was out of the question. Most recently, we have where Charlotte came from. Charlotte's the only name I can think of for a pig. You know, Charlotte Swift. Charlotte's the only name to come up with for a pig. And most recently, like last year, a pig's heart was transplanted into a person. Not just person to person, but an animal heart transplanted to a person. It was a remarkable development, very astonishing development in that respect. So that kind of gives you a little bit, but now we are in the digital age with fantastic amounts of computing power, which is practically free. Fantastic amounts of data storage, also practically free, and a tremendous impetus to use it. And let's see what we can come up with. So what do we have now in today's world? I have two kind of major categories that let's talk about on the point of what we can do now for human enhancement. Okay? Here's one, is physical improvements. Physical improvements. And the second is going to be mental improvements. And to some extent, psychological ones also. So the physical and then the mental / psychological. What do we got physical? We have 3D printing. We are perfectly capable right now of growing skin in a petri dish. Do it all the time for burn victims and other sorts of circumstances. It's been life-saving, it's been glorious. 3D printing, however, is is literally, if you can figure out, and we are very close to it, if not there already, how to replicate human cells or individual cells, then it's only this close to 3D printing them in a box. Here's another example. We have all kinds of things that are wearable right now. Wearables is a new business product category of smart wearables. So, for example, implants that will help control symptoms of Parkinson's. What's another one? Implants of pacemakers that will have a device that will send heart information straight to your doctor. Some sort of devices that will continually measure your glucose without the need of Elizabeth Holmes. And all of that is current. We also have, we'll talk more about this next week, eyeglasses, smart glasses, which will communicate all kinds of things to you about who you're looking at and so on through kind of a heads-up display in your vision, in the top of your vision. So that, Google came up with it, I think. I like Google for the most part, but there are moments when you have to think, as John Oliver put it the other night, this is getting very creepy very fast. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at this person, and instantly I know whether they're married, whether they're divorced, whether they go to church, where. On and on and on. Anything I programmed want to know.
Charles, I saw last night on the news that they're talking about doing implants, so you won't need to pay for something, you just.
I think the comment is we see on the news talking about doing implants that'll have your payment card information on them, and you just literally, like you were one of the grand pashas of India, wave your hand and the door will open. Not hard, perfectly capable, which raises the eternal question to navigate and negotiate. We can do these things now, should we? What are the implications of doing some of these things? Let's continue. Ectogenesis. Who knows what that is? Ectogenesis. Ever heard of it? It will allow a fetus to be grown to term outside the mother's body.
From petri dish to.
I'm sorry?
From petri dish to birth, huh?
Yes. From petri dish to birth. It's here, I'm told. Now, how shall we navigate or negotiate that? What are the implications of that? Now, I will tell you that one of the blessings of my life is that unless the Lord does some sort of Abraham and Sarah thing on me, I've seen the last inside of a maternity ward. And I know I won't, and I can fully appreciate exactly what is involved in pregnancy. That said, how do we negotiate that? What will be lost?
The brain.
The brain?
When will you say the birth occurred?
When's its birthday?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure there can be some convention developed, but at some point theologians will leap upon it, and if some doofus negligently lets the power go off, is that homicide? What is Hosch? The brain? The communication between mother and yet unborn child?
And the decision about whose genes get to be passed on.
Well, that question about whose genes get to be passed on and who decides who makes that decision, that's one of the things we'll talk about toward the end of it. You see what's happening here? See what's happening here? None of these issues, that question is new under the sun. But the questions of how parents relate to their children, how that relationship grows, how that is structured, what that means, really, in the deepest possible sense, is one of the questions we've been arguing about 4,000 years as matters of faith. And now they'll have to be applied here. We can do it, shouldn't we?
Depends on if we truly believe we're made in God's image.
If we truly believe we are made in God's image, and we do.
Our history seems to suggest that if we can do it, we will.
Steve was just saying our history suggests that if we can do it, we will. And that undoubtedly is true. Undoubtedly that is true. And we will then do our best to try to control, manage, or at least understand it. But our history also shows, doesn't it, that we haven't done all that hot a job.
Well, there's also Murphy's Law.
And there's Murphy's Law. There's also Murphy's Law. What a blessing it is to be able to talk to a group who are above the age of discretion and have experienced these things and who are accustomed to surprises, and have lived beyond them. Here's some more. We can now create, through replication, many, M-I-N-I, many organs, small organs. And, let's use the metaphor in a petri dish to see how things work, to study, and literally to experiment on. I am told that includes brains or portions of brains. Segments. Each one has a different function all over the place. Brain is still the unknown territory for most purposes because it is so complicated. But we can create segments, replicate segments of it. Does that mean we can create our own twins to experiment on? Is that really what that means? Yeah. As far as I can see right now, it's just in part. But if 40 years ago, I would have said that one of these days we're all going to be standing here able to communicate cheerfully to the other ends of the world by virtue of these, wearing on our or carrying in our pockets Dick Tracy watches that you would never could not possibly imagine, and have more computing power in our pockets than the world had ever seen. Would you have believed it? So is it that much harder to extend our imagination now into the future? The human genome, this happened, was announced on March 31st, 2022, 2 weeks ago. They finished mapping the human genome 2 weeks ago. Finished mapping the human genome. What the genome is, I had to look it up. It's the entire set of instructions of genetic instructions in a human cell. And you think, you're, from the tone of your voice, Charles, it sounds like you understand it was complicated. Yes, there are 3.1 billion base cells in a human cell to be gone through. In 2003, they announced they'd done it, but actually it was only 92% complete. And like we were saying, the last 8% is always the hardest part. So they finally got it done. And what that's going to allow scientists to start working on, start figuring out, are things like, why do those giant tortoises live so long? What gives them that kind of longevity? Why do some people thrive at high altitudes and others don't? And what causes cancer? Among much else. All these things are physical developments that are happening right now. Many of them are unalloyed goods with absolutely no downside. A lot of people, I grew up in a small town in Georgia, as you know, but 20 miles away was where anesthesia was first performed in public, in an operation in 1842. Crawford W. Long did it. In a little bitty place in Jefferson, Georgia, which time has otherwise forgotten. Mass General in Boston claimed to have done it. 3 months later, they made a big production of it. So that's where the big pictures are and the cover of, the book on medicines on the coffee table. But anesthesia, bless it. Bless everybody that ever had anything to do with it. It's great. And the only problem with it is we don't have enough of it. But that, many of these are unalloyed goods. But let's turn to the mental impressions. Ketamine, a drug called ketamine, was a party drug. Those who like that sort of thing call it Special K. And it's a hallucinogenic and a mind-altering substance, very much like LSD. But the VA, Veterans Administration, has realized that it's very effective in ways nothing else is for treating the post-traumatic stress syndrome of many veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. What will be the long-term implications of that? And who knows? For a long time, do you remember that book a few years ago, Prozac Nation? Heard about that, Prozac Nation? It was a more studied book. It was non-fiction about just the sheer volume of Prozac that's prescribed in this country. But you remember 1984? Remember Brave New World? You saw the movie Gattaca or whatever that name was? All those, in one way or another, address the question of assuming we can make people happy. Or in Prozac's case, dull the edges of some of the depressive characteristics. And depression is an evil, wicked thing. Assuming we can do that, should we aspire to make everyone happy?
Charles, you talked about genes and structures, but there are things like consciousness and emotions and thoughts.
Consciousness, emotion, thought. Now we're talking about pharmaceuticals. Fentanyl will stop consciousness, put you straight to sleep. That's what they use during major surgeries. Emotion, thought can be enhanced by a number of fog clearing or fog dispensing pharmaceuticals.
He said as he took a cup of coffee and
He said, Steve is pointing out that I'm enjoying my coffee. I'm trying to You know,
Little caffeine.
The Lord works in mysterious ways.
Yeah.
and emotions. Now, still trial and error, but it's miles ahead of where it was. And even the novelists for a generation have been writing about what would a world look like in which everyone, or of which people, most people who could afford it, who could get access to it, which raises its own set of ethical questions. How would they relate to people who aren't there yet? And how would developed countries relate to undeveloped countries? How would, frankly, look at your own life for a moment. No one, everyone is driven to their knees in life sometimes. What strengths, what has that experience done to you? You may not have wished it on your worst enemy, but what strengths, what resilience comes from unhappiness, from trouble, from pain? It's always been part of the world's reality. The direction of some of this is that there may come a time in our lifetimes when that need not necessarily still be true. What will we have lost? What will we have lost?
Our humanity.
I'm sorry?
Our humanity.
Our humanity. Many of the questions that we're asking here, and this is why I urge everyone to look at not only at our own faith, but at all the faith traditions that the world has seen, is that these very questions are asking, what does it mean to be human? That's what these technologies are forcing us to confront. What does it mean to be human? There is a woman named, appropriately enough, Scary, wrote in the 1980s that to know pain is to know certainty. To know pain is to know certainty. To hear about pain is to have doubt. To know it yourself is to be certain. And I offer to you that from the Garden of Eden to the last page of Revelations, that is one of the most important messages of our faith. There is also, within this technology, the metaverse. Metaverse is sometimes, have you heard of augmented reality? Augmented reality is a combination of things that allow you to experience, up to a point, life through a computer, through the intermediation of technology, with gloves that allow you to feel, where you can see, hear, feel, smell, which is one of the most powerful, surprisingly powerful, because the place in the brain where you smell is adjacent to your memory. That's why when you smell that certain smell, you're back in your grandmother's kitchen. One of my favorite smells is walking in the door of the Park Street subway station in Boston, because all of a sudden I'm 18 again. First time I smell it. To everyone else, it's awful. To me, it's a time machine. Those reality, you can now live your life in those things. But isn't it a form of escapism? Now, it's the best imaginable simulator, like airline pilots do when they train in the Army on these things, at least in the U.S. Army. But it is also a form of escapism. But now there are huge investments in this stuff, massive investments in this stuff, where people can buy and sell real estate in fiction, in computerized villages, cities, towns. And I laughed to myself, real estate? I mean, that got the term because that was in merry old England, that was everything that was real. That gold. Real estate in the metaverse, yeah. What are the ancillary effects of this? I may have mentioned this at some point. I've forgotten. It's one of my favorite anecdotes. You remember Walter Cronkite? Walter Cronkite's news stories were about 2.5 minutes long. And we were glued to them, weren't we? Yes, we were. We were glued to them. Well, today, I read something the other day that we'll give you 5 headlines in 30 seconds. Why is that? Because with the effect of these, the American attention span has dropped like a rock. Some years ago, it was measured at it was at 12 seconds. A few years later, it was measured at 8. I don't know what it is now, but I can tell you that a goldfish's attention span has remained constant at 9 seconds. So we have in America slightly less attention span capacity than the goldfish. And now on the mental aspect of all, we come to the biggest one of all, CRISPR. Does that name ring any bells? CRISPR. Don't leave out the CRISPR/Cas9 technology. This is so new and so revolutionary that most of the science, and a lot of it was done, a lot of the basic science and development has been done at UT Southwestern. One of the leading scientists in this field was a member of this church. And it is now considered very, very sensitive. Because what it is it allows scientists to take a DNA strand, building blocks of human DNA strand. And you can identify, say, well, this little segment right here, here's a strand. This little segment right here is what's causing the problem. Snip. And replace it with a good one. That's it, and that's a layman's view from a nutshell. Gene editing is now possible. Now, what that means, when you can clip out the damaged genes and replace them with good ones, we may be able to avoid tragic birth defects, to repair and change that which was in the history of humanity has been thought to be part of life. We may also be able to provide fantastic boosts this way in intelligence, strength, power, even compassion. And many of you are parents. Who doesn't want every advantage you possibly can get for your children?
So Charles, it seems like a lot of what you're saying is that everything's got a plus side and a not so plus side.
And it's, then you got far from the baseball bat or the kitchen knife.
Where did they get the new gene, the good gene?
The good gene. The good gene, when we are doing that, are we not coming perilously close to trying to create a super race? Do we really want, right? We are at that, this is its own topic. CRISPR and the moral and ethical implications of CRISPR. It doesn't have an E. Are the cutting edge. Gene therapy is the spear point of this exact issue. This exact issue. Now, do we really want designer babies? Where does that meet your faith?
Charles, I don't claim to fully understand it myself, but the development of the COVID virus was antivirus, rather, the shot that we've all taken.
The vaccine.
The vaccines were developed with a new kind of technology that wasn't formerly possible because of the ability to manipulate the genetic code and RNA replication. Are all of us just a couple of booster shots away from having been an inferior human being than we were? Is that I mean, are these micro steps that we're taking?
That is a characteristically good question. Are these micro steps that we're taking toward some sort of this sort of enhancement, ethically and theologically? The vaccine was very controversial. You know, where you had all these religious exemptions popping up all over everywhere. And as a matter of fact, I have a thought on that. I have a thought on that. But I start this way. I start with my second major point. Remember, my first one was you don't solve ethical problems with technology. You navigate and negotiate, right? And the second major point is God created the brains he gave us. And he created them for maximum use, for uses to his purposes, which previous generations, each generation since the Enlightenment has developed more. And our biggest problems have come when we have denied and stunted our own intellectual growth in the name of theology and said to one another and to ourselves, don't ask that, don't do that, don't question that, don't challenge that. By the way, have you ever noticed what's written on our wall that you walk past? Here you will challenge and be challenged. That's on the wall. Right over there in the hallway. When we don't do that, then we wind up, remember, you don't believe in Santa Claus, he doesn't come. How many of y'all were told that when you were children? When you were just getting to that point where you were starting to ask the awkward questions. It was very similar. It was effective too. Worked too, did it for a year or two. How similar that has been to if you don't believe this box, you're going to hell. When very possibly true meaning of faith is perhaps Now, God knows more about the salvation business still than we do. Now, consider this possibility. God, having created all our brains for science, science has nothing to fear from God, and God has nothing to fear from science. And we have nothing to fear from science either, so long as we also use wisely the hearts God also gave us for worship, for awe, and for thought, and for responsibility. Now, as we laughingly realized, our track record on that is not so hot. But here's the deal behind the religious objections to the vaccine. You remember, everybody, it was all the fight over mandates. The religious exemption that was solved by many, maybe 15%. Said that the vaccine was connected to abortion, that it came from, in some mysterious, cloudy way, nobody quite could articulate it, aborted fetal tissue. Here's what this was. There was an abortion in 1978 in Belgium. The fetal tissues were used for study of human cells and human cells in some respect, I don't know how, but they were studied so extensively and so thoroughly that the information resulting from those studies became used and accepted as a baseline for how the human body works, so that you wouldn't have to repeat any of that later on. This was a, if I understand it correctly, this was a near uniform and near universal agreement on this is how the results of these studies are how this stuff works. Okay? And since then, now notice this is not the same thing as using the cells themselves. They have been discarded decades ago. This was 1978 again, or something like that when this was happening. Only the information derived from that created this comprehensive baseline against which you could measure things is what's used. And that information is used before, in the development of virtually every medicine you take, over the counter and prescription. Tylenol, yep. Advil, yep. Benadryl, yep. What else? High blood pressure medicine, yep. Cholesterol medicine, yep. All of it is measured starting from all that. Now think of everything you take, everything any member of your family takes, everything you've ever heard of. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. And it was all based on that basic information. Now, there's no fetal tissue used in any of that, no demand for new fetal tissue, no encouragement of new abortions in any respect of any of that, right? Now, here's the thought. Nevertheless, and forget explaining that fetal cells aren't used in it or used to make it. Forget any, discrepancy between the things you will take and the things you won't, because you think these are connected to abortion when by that thinking everything is. Forget all that. Can you resolve this issue of faith in this way? Meet the vaccine objector where he or she is. So I'll start with, okay, abortion is awful, terrible, worst thing in the world. Assume, since that's what this person thinks, you don't have that debate. Just say, okay. Okay. And that somehow, some way along the way, this vaccine was developed in some incomprehensible connection with that. Okay? Start there. Now move to today. Today, the vaccine has prevented in this country millions of deaths. Millions. Worldwide, possibly billions. And many, many, many people are alive today because of those vaccines. So, look what's happened. Start with where you may be. And realize that with the application of science and God-given brains, right? Something awful has been transformed. Awfulest thing you can imagine has been transformed into something new, life-affirming, life-saving. And who cannot see the hand of God in that? Is that not the very meaning of the gospel? To transform the most horrible things you can imagine into the most beautiful. And realizing that, taking the vaccine in that respect, no matter what you think about its origins, or the origins of so much else, is not taking the vaccine in that light, an act of true worship and of kneeling before the sovereignty of a loving God. How fortunate we are to be able to reflect on these things of all days during Holy Week. Thanks so much. Thanks be to God. Amen.